Well, health workers treating Rohingya refugees say they have visited women with injuries consistent of violent sexual attacks who give horrific accounts of their suffering.
We know that in conflict and in any highly stressful situation, the number of acts of sexual violence actually increases. But the stories that we hear from survivors are horrific. We have situations where people have been raped by multiple perpetrators, and some of them have been so incredibly violent that they are not able to verbalize anymore. We see dramatic mental health consequences from the acts that have been committed.
Physicians working in the Cox's Bazar refugee camp in Bangladesh say they have seen at least 25 Rohingya women with injuries normally caused by group sexual assaults. One of the patients said Myanmar's army forces assaulted her and burned her 2-year-old infant alive.
I have 5 children. One daughter was thrown in the fire by soldiers and 2 are missing. I left my native village with my 2 children. But before I left, 3 soldiers entered my house and raped me. At the time, I was bleeding and I was crying. Then the military caught my youngest child and threw her in the fire. Another soldier beat me with a gun. Then I continued to cry. They killed my 2-year-old in the fire. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. I am shocked. I lost my children, my husband, my mother and father.
Meanwhile, doctors at a clinic run by the International Organization for Migration said they had seen signs of, quote, inhumane attacks on hundreds of women. The reports provide witness accounts of sexual attacks carried out against Rohingya women and young girls by the army in Myanmar's Rakhine state. The United Nations has called the atrocities by Myanmar's army a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Meanwhile, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees said the flight of Rohingya Muslims to Bangladesh is now the most urgent refugee emergency in the world. Let's cross over to Manchester, joined by the Director, Center for Muslim Affairs, Mr. Jahangir Mohammed. Thank you so much for being with us. Well, the situation just seems to go from bad to worse now. Talk to us about more and more as these individuals are being examined. We're hearing about the horrific situation that they have faced in Myanmar. What can be done at this point in time that's not being done?
Well, what we have here is something that we've already known for 5 years, that the Rohingya are being persecuted, genocide is taking place, and as in any conflict situation, the most vulnerable people within vulnerable communities are also women and children. This happens everywhere, and so it's inevitable that these stories are true. And all we're seeing now is medical confirmation of what these women and these communities have been saying for a long time, and what we've been seeing on social media, on Facebook and other social media, showing the atrocities and the victims with their injuries. So, it's ironic that at the same time as the UN just met and announced that they would investigate the crimes against Yazidi women that ISIS have committed, which are grotesque and terrible and should be investigated, and the people should be brought to justice. But nobody has mentioned the Rohingya Muslims here and their perpetrators. Why is there no equivalent motion at the United Nations to bring the perpetrators of the crimes against Rohingya women to justice? There seems to be a separate standard for Muslim victims around the world and non-Muslims. If the perpetrators were Muslims committing these acts against non-Muslim women, the world would be outraged and this would be investigated. And none of that is happening. There's no moral outrage. There's reporting now and coverage But most of the politicians barely said a word at the UN last week about this. There was no great moral outrage. There was no declaration that these acts are evil. Instead, other people and nations who are peaceful are being declared as the greatest evil around the world. So what needs to happen is clearly that Muslim masses and the Muslim nations need to take this matter into their own hands, whether that's bringing people to justice, whether it's withdrawing ambassadors and closing the Myanmar embassies in their nations, and other means to help these people and ensure that the perpetrators are brought to justice in the same way as the UN is bringing the perpetrators of the crimes against Yazidis to justice.
Okay, thank you so much for being with us out of Manchester, Mr. Jahangir Mohammed, Director, Centre for Muslim Affairs.